Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to answer the question, what is the difference between one of the most expensive katana on the market and one of the least expensive katana on the market? What do you get for the difference in money at $13,000 versus $70 for 185 times the cost? What do you get? Also, which one might be right for you, and why might the answer be both? Those are the questions I intend to address in this video. Hopefully, it's interesting. To introduce the swords, let me first talk about the cheaper guy right here. This is a Musha Tatsu-Maki. I believe Dragon Roll is the name of the sword, or the way it would translate. It is made from 1045. It has synthetic components, whether it be the synthetic silk, the synthetic samegawa, alloy fittings. It's made from one of the less expensive materials out there, but it is a very functional sword. I reviewed one very similar to it some years ago. I'll link the video in the description down below if you want to see how well it holds up to doing various sword-like activities. Now let's talk about the more expensive sword. This is a Higotora 258 katana. It was made by Akamitsu Toro Kanetsugu and Kanamitsu, a father-son pair whose name I'm probably massacring, but a relatively well-regarded set of smiths in Japan that are licensed, making swords a traditional way. So this is made of Tamahagane. It has undergone a very deliberate and intentional polish. It is manufactured in a way where everything is fit the way it's supposed to. It has solid silver fittings, real silk, real samegawa, but it is also $13,000, or was when the yen was a little stronger when this sword was produced, and it was also in a much better condition. So please, throughout the video, think of it like it was when it was brand new, as shown on the Higotora website, and not in the somewhat disheveled, diminished condition that it is today. There is signs of use on the ito. The manuki have been removed. There's some chipping in the lacquer work here, as well as on the scabbard. There's some blemishes on the blade. It's still a fantastic sword, but it's a little bit of a far cry from the perfection it was when it came out of the shop. I'm going to drop a little bit of a hot take here, and that is that both of these swords are absolutely amazing for very different reasons, though. For $13,000, you get a sword made with traditions that probably should have died a long time ago, and through passion and diligence have been kept alive and are still being practiced today, and you are fortunate to have access to them. This sword is a piece of living history, manufactured by people that went through a very painstaking and traditional process to be licensed to make them. It's made from high-end quality materials and is basically a piece of high art equivalent to any paint on canvas that you can find. It's also an amazing practice tool if you want to study the traditional arts that would have used swords like this. This is an amazing tool to do that, done with all of the precision and care that an antique object would have been done with. It is made with very high quality materials by competent people, and I am very fortunate to be its caretaker. Below, you have a modern marvel of economies of scale and supply chain and business and capitalism. I'm not exactly sure what, but the fact that you can get a functional sword that does sword-like things for the price of a mediocre dinner is really fundamentally amazing to me. This sword still requires handwork. It still requires a lot of material. It still requires a lot of know-how and good execution. Is it equivalent in quality? Absolutely not. However, it is brought the barrier to entry very, very far down for people to enter this hobby. If you want to practice iaido with a live blade, if you want to practice cutting, if you just want to have a katana because they're really cool, this is an easy place to start. And one day, people that buy these may buy these. So it's lowered the price of entry for people to enter this hobby in whatever form they want to. And it's also really cool and fun to play with. I'd obviously encourage you to use caution, but the fact that you can have a katana that does katana-like things for $70 is awesome to me. Back to the basics. What do you get for 185 times the price? Well, I'm going to go over first the method of construction. First, these swords are made in very, very different ways. The Shinsakudo is going to start with bloomery steel. So somebody has to go and manufacture the steel, and it comes in basically what look like little, I don't know, rocks, little moon rocks, little space nuggets. They go through a process of refinement done by the smith to basically make this sword. And it's incredibly laborious and painstaking. I'm not going to really elaborate a whole lot on the process because there are a number of documentaries that cover how the steel is made, how the sword smiths use that steel, and how they combine it into one of these objects. I will say that the level of attention here is really quite amazing. I've seen a number of forge welded blades, which is fundamentally what is happening throughout the course of this blade's construction, that have little imperfections and little openings and things like that. It's very hard to get a seamless construction from the materials that start here. And this blade is perfect. It doesn't have any flaws. It's absolutely amazing. Very, very well done stuff, and incredibly laborious, incredibly painstaking, and also quite risky to make. During the manufacture of this sword, It's very likely, because they're water quenched to my understanding, that swords break, and the ratio by which they break is honestly quite high, even for experienced people. At least that is my understanding. So imagine investing hundreds of hours in making a sword only to have it snap in half and have to start over again. The level of competency you have to have a pretty high yield and also a high quality is pretty staggering. Now, the method of construction here is quite a bit different. For $70, you get a sword that generally starts as bar stock and then is forged in some way, sometimes in pairs or more, to shape. And then it is more ground the rest of the way. This is going to be forged out to its shape, its final shape, quite a bit more than this guy is right here, which is going to have a lot more grinding involved. In terms of tempering, as I mentioned, this is water quenched to see the hamon, which you will undoubtedly see in more detail later. This doesn't have any of that. It has a through hardening process, which is done in oil. The survivability is much higher. At the same time, it doesn't have an edge that's as hard. It's not going to hold that edge as well. It's also still kind of soft, and so it will bend rather easily. That's the nature of these 1045 swords. It does have what looks like a hamon on it, but it's not in any way the same metallurgical effects from the more expensive sword. It is more or less ground on, and so it's the effect of sanding and tricks of light. That's how you get that effect. From a distance, it looks like it might have a hamon, but even at a distance, it's really a pale comparison between the authentic sword. The more expensive sword also incorporates a process that really isn't done on this one. There is a level of polishing that is done on the most expensive sword that is very painstaking. There's a number of stones that a person is using. They're basically taking this thing, grinding it on a rock for a bunch of hours until you get the polish that is happening here. And it's done to a degree that you can make out all sorts of different metallurgical effects in the steel. There's a lot to appreciate here. If you are having this as an art object, there's just a ton of interesting things to see here that you can be enamored with. The less expensive sword doesn't really have that. There is a level of polishing, but it's probably going to be done mostly with power tools, and it also isn't intending to bring out any characteristics in the steel. There's not as much, in fairness, to bring out. It's not folded. It's not differentially hardened. There are some perhaps banding effects that could be brought out if a similar process would be used. However, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on there, and it's obviously not the intent of the sword. So it doesn't have forging scale on it. At the same time, it doesn't have anywhere near the same level of polish that this one would have. Now, to talk about the fittings, that's this tsuba on either one, the kasha at the end, the fuchi here, the minuki, which you can't see on this one. Both of these have cast fittings, so the method of construction isn't entirely dissimilar between them, which is a little bit unfortunate. For $13,000, you might expect to get hand-engraved fittings, though that would likely increase the price of this sword substantially. As it is, it has solid silver fittings, so it's made of a precious material, but they are all at the same time cast fittings. So more or less, there's a mold that's made. One might be a metal mold, one might be a wax mold. It's tough to say, but either way, the fittings are done in a process that is casting. The disparity between them, one is the materials that are used, but two, the quality. I can make out a lot more detail on the more expensive sword, you would certainly hope for. And this is also a set of fittings that I haven't seen over and over and over again, as where the fittings on this are one simple, and I have seen them many, many times on many, many swords. They're less unique, less special, and at the same time, made fundamentally in a similar way. How much is the uniqueness worth? How much is the quality of materials worth? I'm not exactly sure, but it does make this a little bit more unique. There are also more fittings on here. So we have a koiguchi, a silver piece around the mouth of the sword. We have a kurikata, this little cap right here, which would hold the samegawa on, and a kojiri at the end. It's also worth noting that the kojiri at the end, the koiguchi over here, are inset into the wood. They're done in a very painstaking way, as where the metal koiguchi here is layered over the top. Naturally, it just takes more time. It's more laborious. The fitting is more detailed. It's more properly sized. If I move down to the scabbard, we have a one-of-a-kind, made-to-fit this blade scabbard. One-of-a-kind might not necessarily be the right word, but this scabbard was made to fit this blade and only this blade, as where this scabbard is made to fit blades of this size. This is a modular kind of construction. They're making a bunch of these in a batch, and they make a bunch of sayas in a batch at the same time, and then they should fit together. But this handle, this scabbard, is not made for this sword. It's made separately and then put together on this sword because they're made to a template. The handle and scabbard on this sword are only made to fit this particular sword. They're made to fit the way it came out exactly. This might require a little bit of a persuasion to fit on. There might be tolerances that have to be shimmed and things like that, as where that's not the case on the top one. The difference there is that it feels like it's supposed to in the hand. It comes apart relatively easily if you want to clean it. It also glides in and out of the scabbard like it's on rails. This one is a little bit more pokey. It's raspy when you draw it in and out. If you try to take it apart, it will likely require some effort, and to put it back together, it may not go back together quite the same way. That's the byproduct of having it done in modular construction, where pieces might have mild variations and having to force them together. Now, at this point, I've drastically oversimplified some of the quality differences in the materials and construction method, but nevertheless, you have hopefully some vague idea of the disparity between them. It's time to talk about how they feel, though. How does that translate into movement? And it's not really a fair comparison given their size disparity, but what I can say is that when I draw and sheathe this sword, it glides in and out like it's on rails. It's a practice tool. It's a refined instrument that doesn't give me any obstacle other than my own technique. Everything is tight, well fit, and just overall perfectly done. This one is mediocre at best. The ito is not super tight. The sword is raspy as it goes in and out. As a training tool, it's a bit of an obstacle to get around. At the same time, I can do those things. It still draws and sheathes. I can still handle it. I could lacquer the handle if I wanted it to be more secure. It still can cut. It still can do those things, albeit much worse than its much more expensive counterpart. Now, this is not going to be the best cutter out there. It may not even be the best tool out there. It's a heavy, beefy blade. At the same time, this one is just, it's a shadow of this guy here in terms of a practitioner's tool. In terms of cutting, well, the more expensive sword, I haven't cut a lot with it. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage with it at the moment, but I can tell you that it's a sufficient and amazing cutter. It's nervy to use it because it's very expensive and you don't want to chip it, break it, or do anything dumb with it. Also, the more you cut with it, the more the characteristics in the steel get diminished, etc., etc. So there's a little bit of a nerviness, at least for me personally, using a sword this expensive, but I can say that it does an excellent job. It has a geometry that is well suited to cutting tatami mats. I don't really use it on bottles or things like that because I could chip the blade, but pool noodles and stuff like that, I have no objection to using it on. The less expensive sword is not as sharp. It could be sharpened, but it doesn't have the same edge geometry to really ever be as effective a cutter. Also, it doesn't have any of the prettiness. It doesn't feel like a genuine sword. It kind of feels lighter than it should be, but it is a functional sword. I can still do all of the same activities. I can practice the ido. I can practice cutting. I can sharpen the sword. I can do all of those things, but certainly not to the same level of capability as the more expensive sword. Now, you certainly don't have to spend $13,000 to get a sword that is an effective cutter. You could spend much less and get a geometry that is superior to this sword and better performing. In fact, I would argue there's probably $300 to $500 swords out there that will outperform this in cutting and durability. They won't necessarily compete with it on the level of art, craftsmanship, and tradition. The next thing to talk about perhaps is durability. Now, obviously, I haven't broken either of these swords because they're in good shape. They're sitting right before you here. Well, you can't see them at the moment, but they are still whole, I promise you, underneath here. I haven't broken a $13,000 Shinsakudo in my tenure on YouTube or breaking swords, but I can tell you I've smashed a number of differentially hardened blades. If I were to take this to the same kind of abusive testing that I do in my videos, it would break just as quickly as all of the others. The edge would chip, and I would be able to smack it on the spine, and it would break in half. It would probably hold up to logs and a bunch of other materials reasonably well, would be my estimation. It's a finely crafted piece of steel. However, the nature of its construction is not one that lends itself to profound amounts of durability when doing stupid things. This guy, however, is a real son of a bitch to break. Let me tell you, because it is softer, it tends to not crack in half when I smash it on the spine, and it's really quite laborious to break. Now, does it cut as well? No. Does it perform as well? No. But is it harder to break and more durable? Yeah. You can smash this thing on logs and on water bottles, and it might diminish. You might need to sharpen it, but it's very, very loath to come apart and to break into two pieces and become a helicopter of death. In terms of durability, this $70 sword is probably going to stay a weapon longer and more effectively than the $13,000 sword, which, granted, depends a little bit on what you're hitting, but perhaps in the heat of battle where you're deflecting and flinging off polearms, this sword is going to bend and you're going to be able to straighten it out, and you're going to be able to last many battles before it breaks in half. This is a little bit more prone to breaking, and you have to be better with your technique in order to not have it diminish its condition very quickly. That's less about this sword, incidentally, and more about the nature of construction. Through hardened blade made from softer steel is just a very, very durable sword. at least when you talk about abuse. It bends easy, it diminishes, it loses its edge, but it stays together in one piece and relatively straight for you to do pokey stabby things more effectively than differentially hardened blades tend to do. All right, sword friends, hopefully this has answered some of the questions. What are the differences? Everything. For $13,000, you get a piece made by licensed Japanese swordsmiths, made in Japan from really high-end and very nice materials. You get a refined instrument to practice with and a piece of fine art. For $70, you get a sword that will allow you to practice swordsmanship if you choose, allow you to have fun in your backyard if you want, and is just a cool object to look at if you don't care about all of the refinement here. So hopefully at this point, the disparity between the two is a little bit more clear than it was. Which one is right for you is a question that I asked at the beginning. Well, if you don't have $13,000, then this is not right for you, but you can get nice Shinsakudo on the used market for much less money. If you are a person that values the refinement, the artistry here, then there's not really a substitute that you're going to find in the $70 range. And I'd encourage you to pinch your pennies until you can get in this ballpark or find a lucky secondhand sale that has something similar to it. The level of detail here, the artistry, the craftsmanship, the history just isn't going to be replaced by a reproduction. So if that's what you're in the market for, then getting something like this is the only thing that's going to scratch the itch. However, if you're new to collecting, you don't know which sword to get yet. You want to buy a Shinsakudo, but you don't know which one is going to fit, and you only have one shot at spending $10,000 or more on a sword. Getting something like this for $70 can inform you a lot. One, you have a sword, and the point of balance gives you some idea of your preferences. Training with it gives you some idea if you want to pursue Iaido or not. Cutting with it gives you some experience, at least, in how swords react to cutting before you risk damaging your more expensive sword. So getting a sword like this, I think for a new person coming into collecting or practicing, this is absolutely a worthwhile thing to get, just as a training tool, just as an opportunity to practice with things and get the dumb out of your system is what I often say. Why might you want both? Well, I have both, right? I won't want to use this if I want to do something stupid with a sword, if I want to practice edge-on-edge contact, if I want to cut metal objects, if I want to practice on armor and see what happens when I thrust into it. Any of those kind of experiences are really expensive to test on a $13,000 sword. Would it be more interesting? Sure, but I don't have the budget to do that. For $70, I can get a couple of these things and do some experiments and learn and understand swordsmanship to a greater degree than I would otherwise. I think absolutely if you have the discretionary income to buy something like this, it doesn't mean that you want to break it. It doesn't mean that you want to use it. It doesn't mean that you ever want to take it off the wall. Buying something like this can inform you a lot, even if you're a more experienced person. Having both of them, I think, still have their place. Anyway, those are the questions I set out to answer. Hopefully I have done a sufficient job in doing that. Hopefully you found it interesting. That's all I've got, sword friends. Cheers, and thanks for watching.